Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you had a nice break after the second session. So now we are back for the third workshop of the annual online conference 2025, entitled Research Adaptation in the Face of Climate Change, Insight from Animal Behavior. As you know, climate change is one of the most significant global challenges of our time, one that threatens ecosystem, economies, and the stability of societies worldwide. As temperature rise, weather patterns become more unpredictable and habitats transform at unprecedented rates. The consequences ripple across every level of life on Earth. These rapid environmental shifts do not only affect the species we study, but they also profoundly reshape the way we have to conduct research itself. For researchers, particularly those working in ecology, animal behavior, and field-based science, climate change demands new way of thinking, planning, and adapting. Field seasons are disrupted by extreme weather. Long-term study sites can become inaccessible or altered actually by the climate change. Animal populations shift their ranges or change their behaviors, challenging the assumption that once guided experimental design. Even the ethical and logistical dimension of research evolve as environmental pressures intensify. So this workshop invites us to explore how our research journey could be adapted in response to this. And by sharing experiences, challenges, and creative solutions, our panel will help us better understand how to conduct rigorous, meaningful, and responsible research in an era of rapid environmental change. Ultimately, learning to adapt as researcher is essential not only for advancing science, but also for supporting the societal resilience needing to navigate in an uncertain future. This type of discussion is actually only possible by having experts facing this type of problematic in their line of research, almost daily, I would say. And for this, we have the chance today to receive a panel of three researchers that I will now introduce. So our first panelist is Gopal Murali, DST-inspired faculty fellow in evolutionary ecology at the Indian Institute of Science. His work spans macroecology, global change biology, and intraspecific trait variation, often using large-scale biodiversity data and theoretical modeling. He will speak about how shifting ecological baselines, such as species range shift and local extinction, are reshaping the very system in which we study behavior, and what this means for interpreting behavioral data in a rapidly changing world. Welcome, Gopal. Our second panelist is Professor Erica van der Waal from the University of Lausanne, a leading primatologist whose work centers on the social behavior and ecology of vervet monkeys. She and her team are deeply engaged in sustainability thought at their field sites, and she will share how they make their field research more environmentally responsible. She will also discuss how climate change, especially drought, affect the behavior and social dynamics of vervet population. Welcome, Erica. And finally, our third panelist is Thibaud Monnin, a researcher at IEES Paris, whose work focuses on the ecology and evolution of social insects, particularly ants. His research examines how colony foundation, dispersal strategies, and behavioral flexibility respond to environmental pressures, such as habitat fragmentation and rising temperatures. Today, we'll discuss how global change influences both the system he studies, but also the way he adapts his research approach according to that. So welcome, Thibaud. Welcome, all of you guys. And we will start with the presentation of Gopal. So Gopal, I invite you to share your screen.
Yeah, thank you, Alexis, for the lovely introduction. Can you see my slide?
Yes, it's perfect.
Good. Thank you so much. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers and coordinators for inviting me for this lovely panel discussion, an important discussion on climate change impacts and its implication for how do we do animal behavior research. So I'm Gopal Murali, and most of the things that I've been doing, Alexis already explained about. I mostly work with global data sets, trying to understand both ongoing impacts of climate change and also how we can predict climate change in the future, right? So with that, I would like to talk quite briefly about what I'm going to do today, an overview of my talk. So the first aspect of my talk is going to give an idea of start with what do we know about the impacts of climate change, basically how biodiversity is shifting under climate change across scale, right? So the first section is going to be based on empirical findings or based on some of my work that I did in the recent years. And from there, I'll move on to have some synthesis of how such shifts in biodiversity at the macro scale can affect behavior at the global, the local scale, and also importantly, how it can have feedback between the responses also, in a sense, how behavioral responses, for example, behavioral flexibility in terms of thermoregulation or, for instance, shifts in physiology, can also impact on the other way around on shifts in biodiversity pattern that we see today. And ultimately, I want to use this framework to basically discuss what this means for how we design and interpret our experiments or studies in animal behavior. So first, as I mentioned, first of the talk is going to be mostly about the work that I did, and a bunch of other is going to be mostly on synthesis works of what people have already done. So with that introduction, I will move on. So I'm going to start by stating the obvious, that climate change is already happening. Just to give you an idea, this particular graph shows the amount of warming, mean annual temperature when compared to pre-industrial condition, which is 1980 to 1900. And what you can see here is that in the recent period, warming has steadily been increasing. And most importantly, and most shockingly, is also that the last year, 2024, was the first year that I've already crossed 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. This is actually the climate level that been agreed upon in the Paris Agreement goal, basically to limit warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, but we have already shoot up. And studies have shown that probably we're going to heading towards about 3.2 to 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And obviously, this have important implications on biodiversity and species across the world, including animal behavior. But one of the broad scale responses that people have been already documented is about how species are distributed across space and time. One important consequences of how species are responding is by shifting their distribution ranges, especially either toward poleward or upslopes in their distribution. So what do I mean by this is that using distribution data across time, basically reserving the location where species have been observed in the historical period, what people have shown is that on average, species have been moving towards the pole by about 1.1 kilometer per year. Likewise, species are also moving upslope, basically moving higher in the elevation, just to more or less both these mechanisms basically to keep them within the same temperature what have been experienced in the historical condition. And this upslope shift is about 1.78 meters per year, right? Although these values sounds a little low, there's quite a lot of variation. Some species moves much more faster than the other. Like how their species are changing in space, they're also changing in time. Basically, species are shifting their phenology within a given year. This particular graph shows a toy example of how flowering phenology is being changing in the recent period. Basically, flowering of plants have been advanced by about 2.1 days per decade when compared to the historical conditions. Basically, species are advancing their flowering in early spring, basically, to, again, as a response to climate change, basically. So what are the implications these have in terms of communities, for instance, looking at from a much more broader perspective? So as a consequence of these, communities are getting reorganized rapidly. And two of the major ways by which this could happen is based on local extinctions or range expansion. So illustrate this, imagine if these green location of these trees were to be the distribution of species before climate change. What is happening after climate change basically is that because of local extinctions, species are undergoing extinction at their warmest edge, basically lower elevation limit, for example. And our recent study has shown that of the species included in our study, about 45% of species have already gone local extinction in their role elevation limit, which is about 2,500 species out of the 5,000 species we included in this particular study, a global resurvey study. And some of the species are also undergoing range expansion, basically expanding their cool edge. And we found out about 26% of species are expanding, a little lower than, almost twice as low than species that are undergoing local extinction. So where does behavior fit in this global responses to distributional changes by species? So there are two main mechanisms by which behavior might be affected or might also promote or influence shifts in biodiversity. One is that it enables persistence because behavior can buffer extinction, right? For example, by shifts in physiology, or for example, shifts in their behavior, for instance, by habitat preference, for instance, they can buffer extinction, for example, in their locally. Or in other words, this 55% of species that have not undergone extinction, behavioral mechanism may help in coping up with climate change, right? And also these also enable expansion. For instance, like dispersive behavior enable them to move out to a new location where the condition might be suitable for them. And one of the other indirect consequences that is also less well studied is also that because communities are rapidly also facing new species coming into the species pool, some species might also face novel interactions, especially in terms of competition, predation, and mutualism. And obviously, behavioral might play a huge role in mediating all these interactions. So the bottom line that I want to convey here is basically that behavior sort of forms the core response or the first line of mechanism of how climate change may impact animals. And it can go either direction, right? So I want to highlight this example figure from a review by Monnin et al. In 2010. And what it shows that as environmental change, it directly affects behavior. And of course, this sort of affects species interaction, population dynamics, and evolutionary process, ultimately affecting biodiversity. But then biodiversity on the indirectly affect species interactions, and that might cause shifts in behavior as well. And of course, the point that I mentioned here, B, which is mediating novel interaction, is less well studied, which is like sort of an indirect impact on behavior. So having discussed these two ways by which behavior might be impacted, how common or what type of mechanism or behavioral types are being affected by shifts in climate, right? So one particular study by Beaver et al. In 2017 actually did a systematic review of the types of behavior that have been affected by climate change, and they found shifts in behavior has been documented quite widespread in many different groups. I'm going to highlight one particular figure from this particular study. This shows the type of behavior out of the proportion study that have been affected by climate change, which include reproduction, movement, feeding, habitat use, thermoregulation, and also phenology in all these different type of behavior. And what they find is that the most common changes occurs in reproduction. Out of the studies that they study, reproductive behavior accounted for about 32% of the behavior that has been changing due to climate change, followed by movement and phenology change, and at last by feeding. This particular subset of graph shows how phenology is shifting. Again, you can see within this phenology shift, reproduction tops, followed by movement, behavior, and habitat use. And most importantly, one of the less studied aspects, as I highlighted in my previous slide, is that behavioral mediation of species interaction, for example, competition or predator avoidance, is less studied. It only represents about 8 of the 186 articles that showed actual behavioral response. So having shown this evidence, and that given this widespread responses in behavior in almost all type of behavior, the ultimate question remains now is, how do we need to rethink how we study behavior in a rapidly changing world, right? So in a couple of slides to follow, I'm going to talk about what could be the challenges people might face in animal behavior in terms of with regard to climate change based on the different aspects I mentioned, and also give some hypothetical examples of how that could be potentially tackled. So some of the examples for the challenges that we can discuss later is also is that study sites may no longer reflect the historical baseline condition. Although this is quite stating the obvious, What it means is also that if one were to study one particular type of behavior, it could simply be influenced by climate change rather than other ecological factors of interest. For example, habitat use simply in a particular location may reflect climate stress rather than predator avoidance, for example, right? We know that habitat use, for example, use of microhabitat hiding from predator in terms of under stones for a lizard, by example, is often used as an example of behavior avoidance, but then that could simply be also influenced by climate change stress. One of the other means that has similar implications for this is also that people also tend to use spatial comparisons that might again end up being problematic if it's already confounded by shifting in climate or community structure, especially due to climate change. For example, differences in behavior across sites may actually reflect how much that those sites have experienced climate change rather than ecological drivers, for example, resource use, right? Simply because the behavior differences across space being altered as a response to increase in temperature across sites. And another interesting aspect I thought I would also highlight is that if one were to do comparative analysis of species behavior, for example, might also be influenced by location, right? So what we mean by that is that apparent differences in behavior, for example, in terms of some behavior, for example, flight initiation distance, for instance, that is classically used as a metric for predator avoidance, could simply be at the species level be influenced by where the data is coming from, right? Basically, because for different species, because different locations have been warmed at different rate, the apparent difference at the species level could simply be depend on where those data points are coming from. And ultimately, I also want to highlight one other aspect, although quite rare, long-term studies in behavior, for example, which studies importance of evolution in changing behavior, could also face comparability issues simply because that is being confounded by change in climate over time. So how do we rethink behavior research? I want to quickly summarize those and conclude my talk. So one of the important aspects when I shift my line of research from doing some behavior in my PhD to postdoc on looking at everything from macro level is that things are quite dynamic over time, especially in the recent time, right? So we should always be aware and treat climate and ecological baselines as a much more dynamic state rather than being as a conditions that are fixed in nature. And one can avoid the problems that I've mentioned by, for example, selecting sites, basically choosing the areas where there have been occurred, where there are minimal recent climate change to isolate, for example, non-climatic behavior drivers. And also, for example, consider the position where the data is coming from, right? Within a species range, we have warmest, warm edge and cool edge, basically experience different type of amount of temperatures, for instance. And choosing those study sites within these species distribution range might be important because different locations might be responding drastically to the amount of warming based on their climatic position of the species. And finally, one could also avoid this problem, for example, by increasing the spatial breadth of the analysis, such that the baseline is sort of accounted for in terms of the baseline response that species have in terms of how they exhibit the behavior. And ultimately, if possible, pair the field sites with lab experiments, just to remove the effect of confounding factor of climate change. With that, I would like to conclude my talk with key takeaways. We know that global biodiversity and climate change are challenging the traditional way we conduct behavioral research, especially, for example, people have not accounted for how behavior might account for interaction, for instance, in terms of predator avoidance, for instance. But this condition is also offering risk opportunities in terms of, for example, the primary response of animals actually responding. For example, behavior can actually be used as an early warning signal to understand how that species, for example, is sensitive to climate change, meaning it offers an opportunity to also use that behavior to study their impacts. So therefore, by adapting approaches, we can both account for change and gain deeper insights. And the bottom line is basically not to ignore these changing contexts, but instead harness them to ask novel questions, which could be used to also address climate change, how species are adapting climate change, and use that for conservation in the era of global change. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Gopal. Maybe I can have a follow-up question actually based on that, and like I think all of you can reply. So you were actually talking about the fact that indeed, like environmental factors are not fixed, like it moves all the time. I was wondering, like, what's your opinion about, because I mean, I'm not working so much on the field, more in laboratory, but it's also a feeling that I have in laboratory that it is quite rare in our publication that we are actually communicating about what was the weather that day. I mean, what was the temperature, what was the humidity, maybe the atmospheric pressure. It already happened to me working with bees, for instance, inside, that if it rains outside, they have a complete different behavior, despite the fact that they are not outside. Do you think that it could be actually a great solution to sort of implement a standardization of communicating about this type of data, or could we just like rely more on study that really focus on the effect of climate change? Because I have the thing that at the moment it is maybe not, it is more like study that study climate change, but that we are not able to really make any meta-analysis over really a lot of years of specific experiments. What's your opinion about this?
Definitely. Thank you for asking this question. I very much agree that having some sort of information of where, especially the population of the species being studied, is important. That might be important to, for example, state in the paper of when we do some research. And even if it is done in lab experiment, it will allow us to have some baseline idea of where that population is coming from, what historically it have been experienced, therefore how they might exhibit that behavior even in controlled condition. That would have as a baseline. And definitely as far as a global synthesis, it can definitely act as a baseline to understand how different, not only to account for varying differences in behavior, but also to later on to understand, sort of have an idea how climate change is already affecting behavior, right? Because as I mentioned, that is the behavior is the first line of response of climate change, right? But then it's been not well documented, or in a sense not well synthesized at the global level of how that acts and how that translates to global pattern. And these type of having a standardized approach of stating or having a guidelines or stating those variables that have been conducted would definitely be important to later on synthesize its impacts. Yes.
Okay. Maybe Erika or Thibaud, you want to also follow up on this? No, it's okay. So maybe Erika, we can go with your presentation then.
You see it well, full screen?
All good, yeah.
Okay, I will just mask this. Oh, that wasn't the good one. It was the other one. So good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be a part of this interesting panel discussion. And so today I've decided to really give a presentation that just really show what we have done in my group and what we have observed at my field site working on a wild vervet monkey. So I always start briefly with acknowledgement. So of course, funders and institution. And I like to cite this, oh, I have to click on up. This African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Because so my field site has been now running for 15 years and it's a highly collaborative project. And what you see here is the courtyard of the farm where the team stays in the savannah. And each hand corresponds to one person that spent multiple months or year following the monkeys. And so without them, I wouldn't be here today. And so there are more than 250 people. So I can, of course, not name them all, otherwise the time would be over. But I'm very thankful to all of them. The project where I'm working is in South Africa. And so here you have an idea. So it's really a mixed savanna with a forest area. And we are studying their population of wild vervet monkeys in private game reserve with a multicultural team all year long since now 15 years. So what you see here, it's an aerial picture of the field site. Each of those color shape represent one of the 7 groups that we have been following through time. And so at the moment, we have about 150 monkeys that the team is following over the 15 years. We have in our database over 900 monkeys. We had, as I said, many team members coming to the field site. And what I'm very happy now is that half of the team is South African, which was not at all the case at the start, where on my grants, I was able only to employ 1 South African manager. And then I was trying to attract local students, but without success. And so it was all international people traveling back and forth a lot. And so if you put together those 15 years with all the groups, it leads us to quite a large amount of data on vervet. So we can see also how things have been changing now with climate change. So what I've tried to do to make my field site more sustainable, as I said, first really increase the number of South African staff. Currently, 8 of the 16 people are South African. Then also have imposed longer stay for international students or volunteers. So they stay between 8 to 10 months minimum. And we totally avoid now the short fly in and out for little projects. We have more and more people working on data only in Switzerland, for example. We have been fitting loggers that then provide tons of data, and I have a postdoc that don't need to go to the field and can work on data only. We've installed a solar panel for our electricity. We eat only vegetarian food. We have grouped a weekly town trip, and we're doing our best to do all the recycling possible in the nearest town where we go for the weekly town trip. And then another impact that we had is, so we are working in a 10,000 hectare that is a privately owned farm that was at the start a hunting farm, but was an owner that was fed up with hunters and wanted to move towards ecotourism, but didn't know how to do this. So renting already over 1,000 hectares to us for research was the first step in that direction. And now I'm really involved in trying to push the reserve to join a community-owned project that is developing around that would really be for conservation and research, and for example, for the introduction of very endangered species like the black rhino. And so I wanted to understand if all our efforts are really making a difference or not. So I've asked Ecoservice to do really a carbon impact of an 8-month student that would either come to my field site or stay in Lausanne. Sorry, this slide is in French. I didn't have the time to translate it, but I will guide you through what is important. Sorry. And so the main take-home message is here you see the CO2 equivalent. In Lausanne, it's over 5,000. At the field site, it's just above 3,000. And this includes the flight. And so what we see here is where is the consumption in green of CO2. Of course, to go to South Africa, it is the flying that is the main sources of CO2. But then staying in Switzerland, you have a lot more with the heating, with electricity, and with just what people buy to eat and clothing and other stuff. So I was really surprised. I thought it would be more or less equivalent, but I was surprised to see that we were so much lower. Of course, we need to reduce the amount of flying. And for this, I'm part also of sustainability flying committee in my department, and really try to see how we can still do research like I'm doing abroad, but we'll still try to limit as much as possible. And I think for this, the Animal Behavioral Life Conference is a great initiative to show that we can do great conference without all of us flying all around the world. So well done, guys, for organizing this conference. And then I wanted to show you some data about what changed in my field site across the 15 years. And of course, I think it is linked a lot to climate change, even if some extreme weather changes did happen before. So it's always very hard to know to what extent it is really climate change. But for me, I spent now 20 years in South Africa studying wild vervets. And so the first 10 years have been very stable. And since 2015, things have been totally weird and unpredictable. And so now I'm going to show you just a few slides that were prepared by my postdoc, Miguel Garreta Garcia, for another conference about the effect of a drought that took place between 2014 and 16 and what happened to our study population. So here you can see on the top on the map the different years and how dry it was in South Africa. Where the arrow is where is located the field site. So you see that 2014 was already really dry, but 15 terribly dry, and then 16 was still dry. So it was really like a continuation of extreme dry weather. And we actually had a 3 group that fissioned during this period. So when groups of vervets become too large for the resources, then they fission. So we wanted to understand, was there a tipping point in the vegetation, in the behavior, or in sociality that could help us predict when they're gonna split. And so here you see the 3 groups. So it's 3 neighboring groups with a lot of overlap. So their ecology is very similar. And then we mainly focused on adult females because in vervets, they're the philopatric sex. So male anyway dispersed multiple times. So we wanted to understand what's happening to these females, which one decide to stay or leave. So our 3 main questions were, did the group increase their spatial spread while foraging before fission? Which factor shaped individuals' decision about staying in the original group or leaving? And then finally, which factor shaped individuals' decision about who to stay with? And so about the spread there, we found no pattern because, so here it's the time windows. 0 is when they fission. So it's every time 3 months. That goes in time backwards from when they fission, which is totally on the right, all 3 groups. And we don't see that they were all a lot more spread. One group was very spread before fissioning, but the other 2 not at all. But what we can see in green is the average NDVI, so it's the vegetation index. We see that there is a trend that after peak of NDVI, then we have a lower spread, which is totally normal. More NDVI, more vegetation, more fruits coming out. So this is followed, but we cannot see a tipping point here of when they split it just on the vegetation. Then we looked about the decision of who to stay with. So we found no effect of the female number of dependent offspring or their rank on the decision to stay or leave. But what was significant is that females who lost close kin, this influenced their decision, and all of them stayed if they lost kin before in the drought period before the fission took place. So really this risk avoidance if they already had a really impactful thing happening in their matriline. And then finally about who to stay with. So we looked at grooming bidirectional, and this didn't really have an effect, but the one when we looked at grooming unidirectional, we found there that the one that were grooming more stayed more together, and especially this was the case in 2 groups. In the other group, it was totally flat. But what was very significant for all the groups is the one that spend more time in close proximity stay together. So really spatial proximity seems to be here a proxy. Females who anyway spend time a lot close by, they will decide more to stay together. So this was the little example of this fission. And then I wanted to finish very briefly with what happened last year. So we don't still really know the cause of major death event that took place in my vervet population in 24. I was there in September, and we were following a group one day, And then suddenly field assistant in a neighboring group called me on the radio saying, it's very strange, we're following this group, and the young male who just joined the group a couple of months ago, he is like sleeping in the tree and the whole group has left and he's still there. And I was like, this is very strange. Has he moved at all and or stuff? Does it look as he was suffering? No, he was running before, behaving totally normally. And he was dead there on the tree. And so they stayed for 20 minutes still, and he wasn't moving. So then I went to get a ladder and get him down, and he was dead. But there was no external sign of anything. And when we sent it to autopsy, the only thing the vet said, it must be poisoning. Like we don't understand. There is nothing wrong with this monkey. And so that was very puzzling. It was the first one. Then we found many other dead one when I was there, but they all had also, they were partly eaten by predators. So I thought it was predation, but usually predation, we don't find anything, or we find just the head if it's an eagle. So this was very strange. And then we had a major cold, wet weekend. And then we found many animals, but antelopes, cows die in the neighboring village because it even snow in the province. And usually winters are dry in South Africa. So it was really total behavioral, environmental changes that had really huge effect. So last year in total, we lost 35 monkeys. We didn't find the body of all of them, but most of them were adult females who never dispersed. So yeah, and we could, when they're split at the group, we could follow. So it wasn't group split. And so I've asked my postdoc Josie just this week to make a few figures that you can see what happened with our long-term data set. So here, just to see, you see 3 years, 22, 23, 24. And in red, the number of individuals that disappeared or that we know left the group, like we had also fission and male movement. And you see really this peak of adult females and adult males in 24. That juveniles die, this is very common all the time, but there was something special that year that really impacted the adults. And here it's across all the years, so from 2010 up to 25, the number of disappearance we had in our study population. And this is the peak of last year. And what you see here is most of them here, all this orange part is adult females. Here is when we had the drought. So this was over a longer period, but it affected mainly the juveniles. So it was very different. So here it's really interesting to see, the impact that it has. Here you think that there might be also something happening in the middle, but it's actually that we stopped working on 2 groups for some times, and when we got back to them, many had left, so we don't really know what happened. So one thing that was also striking last year is that out of the 49 adult females, we had only 1 alive baby. So whatever was affecting them was affecting first the baby in the belly. I saw a female giving birth to, like, from the first contraction to giving birth to a baby that needed at least a month more to be alive. And so our population in January that we were following in January 24 was 254 monkeys, and it is now 167. So you can see the huge change that you can have in your sample size because of something in the environment, exactly what we haven't pinpoint now. But it wasn't a disease because it was all the group at the same time. It was very probably something in the river, maybe cyanobacteria or toxin in the plants that they were eating. But it has really major impact on group size and social structure of our vervets. To conclude, I just wanted to end it up on a positive note. So we have now 31 babies this baby season. It's the baby boom for the vervets. So this year is a much better year. And we even for the first time witness twins being born and staying alive for a week only, but which is already the first time we see it in vervets. And then one of them died, not because of malnutrition, but fight within the group. So now the population is catching up. So hopefully we'll go back to closer to 200 monkeys. But it's really impressive, like with this long-term field site, to see how many things out of our control are happening and how can we take this into account and in our studies, and how it it changes everything. And with this, I would like to thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Erika. I have two questions related to your presentation. So like, the first one is that when you say that the female are disappearing, it doesn't mean that they are dying. It just means that they are disappearing from the population, but you don't know where they are going, right?
So females never leave their group. So they are territorial. So either they split with other females, and this we follow and we can see them, and then we encounter them. So they died. Disappeared means they died, but we don't always find the body. Left is if we know that they left and splitted. The green were the one that left, and we know they were still alive. But disappearing, it's 98% that they died.
And I was wondering, like, I mean, like you are running your study far from any city or any place of a building or things like this, because I was sort of wondering if maybe because of this increase of temperature and that maybe the monkeys actually were just like going more into the cities in order to maybe find some more shadow, find some more, like, I don't know.
So we are in a game reserve, but the research area is along the north fence. We have a couple of groups that sometimes go out, but we have individuals with colors, so we see where they go. And we've also, when there was the first death, it was in the male, I told you, it was in a group that sometimes forage outside. So my first idea when the autopsy came back about poisoning, I was like, I need to go and discuss with the villagers. Maybe they have something now again. They never had problems with the vervets, but maybe they have those ones now. And we did a meeting with the local chiefs, and they say they all have dogs, and the vervets are very afraid. They have poaching dogs, and so that the vervets never come in the house. They don't disturb them, and they don't see them. And also the fence is not in a good state, so we have a lot of villagers coming to poach in the reserve. So they also openly said that they would never put poison out to the vervets because they want to eat animals of the reserve. So
yeah, I see.
so,
so it's not advantage to
poisoning.
I see.
But another aspect could be, so the river, the one thing that is similar across all the home range is the river, and they all go and drink there. And usually in winter, it totally dries out. This year, it was raining multiple times, but so there was those patches of water that were very stagnant that might have had bacteria growing in. But it also could be because mining has developed more upstream. We also tested the river quality. It wasn't at level that should be dangerous, but yeah, you never know. Maybe when we looked at the water was not when they drink it and was problematic for them. So there's always the delay between when we noticed and start taking samples and maybe what affected them already. But it's something that they consumed that also impacted the fetus, and that's where for me it was very puzzling to try to know.
Okay. And last question before we go for a Thibaud presentation. So you were saying that these drought moments are very hard to predict. And I was wondering if it's something that for the future you maybe plan to just implement in your line of research, to work with a climatologist, like just in order to maybe predict with more.
So sorry, maybe I wasn't clear. It wasn't the drought itself. It was the tipping point of when the groups decided to split. So they split.
Okay, my bad. Okay.
And I wanted to understand, could we understand from the environment, what was the tipping point that made them decide, okay, now we have, because they were too spread to forage, there wasn't enough food, but each group had different dynamics before they split it. But of course, it's still a small sample size of 3 groups, and their home range are a bit different. So yeah, it's
my bad. I misunderstood.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's me. Sorry. Yeah, so we can go with the talk of Thibaud. Thibaud, you can share your screen. Yeah, it's okay.
Well, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a very interesting talk, so I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to speak a bit about, let's do some stuff. The importance of studying animal behaviors in the face of climate change, and why it's really something useful. So you can see that the environment is exerting some selective pressures, which are going to shape organisms. Sorry, I'm moving some things here. including behavior. And as Gopal has said, environmental changes are actually occurring right now. And this means that the selective pressure are changing. And this means that organisms are changing, including their behavior. And one interesting thing is that behaviors can be seen maybe as one way for organisms to mitigate the effect of global changes. And so I'm going to present a few example works which are going to illustrate this. So the first one is going to see whether habitat fragmentation affect funding strategies in AMS. And this is an example of how global changes is actually affecting organisms. And then two other examples to see whether behaviors can allow organisms to mitigate the effect of global changes. And this is in response to heat stress. Can ants change their nest structure to, in a way, evade excessive heat? And can they change their foraging dynamics in response to heat? And my main conclusion was that studying behavior is actually quite useful and important. So the first example, does habitat fragmentation affect alternative colony funding strategies in ants? As we know, habitat fragmentation is one of the main, well, not the main, but one of the important global changes, which is actually affecting the biosphere. And the ant Nemesina communicula is a good system species because it has two queen morphs. It has wing queen and apterous queens. And this is genetically determined. And that means that they have different strategies that might be impacted by habitat fragmentation. So if you look at wing queens, you can see them as good colonizers. They disperse by flight, which means they can disperse fairly long distances, and they start their new colonies alone, which means that they suffer high mortality and they have a slow growth of their initial colonies. There is a few species where we have actual data on mortality, and typically wing queens have a mortality in excess of 95%. So it's very, very strong selective pressure. And then apterous queens, you can see them as good competitors. They disperse on foot, so they have a very restricted dispersal distance. But then because they go on foot, they can go with workers, which are apterous in ants. That means that they start their colonies with many workers helping. Therefore, they have low mortality and colony growth is much faster. So it's two alternative strategies. So what we did was collecting leaf litter in 24 forests around Paris and 25 parks within Paris to see what was the occurrence and abundance of the queen moth in this kind of habitats. So if you look at the occurrence of queen moth, these are the forests. This is the occurrence, and this is the amount, the proportion of apterous queens. So you have wing queens in green. So many forests had wing queens. Some forests we found no queens, and a few forests only we found some apterous queens here in orange. And this is the occurrence. This is the amount. So the proportion of apterous queen was only in some non-fragmented forest, and just about 25% as the maximum. And if you look at park, it's quite different within the parks in Paris, because you find wing queens in many parks, but you also found apterous queens in many parks. And this is the abundance, the proportion of apterous queens. So in large parks, you could have maybe 40% of the queens actually apterous. So that means that wing queens dominate in the two environment, but apterous queens are relatively more abundant in parks versus forest. And this means that habitat fragmentations affect very strongly the relative success of these two colony foundation strategies. And I think this means that we need to consider global changes, in this case, fragmentation, I guess, in probably most of the works we're actually doing now, because as Gopal said, global changes are everywhere, and the kind of baselines that we found now in our field are no baselines anymore. So we need to take into account global changes, whether this is our topic of interest or not. And so the second example is, can ants, in this case, Lasius niger, respond to heat in a kind of adaptive way? And this is particularly important for insects because they're ectotherms, so they're very, very susceptible to warming. And in particular, under warming, you have faster larval development, and this produces smaller adults. And if you have smaller insects, then you have plenty of cascading effects. This affects the physiology, this affects the interaction with prey, predators, and so on. So what we did was to do an experiment. We took some small colonies with 1 queen and 200 workers, and we put them in soil column in the lab. And we reared the colony under free temperature treatment. So with heating lamps close to the soil column or a bit further away or with neon light. And therefore we had high temperature, medium temperature, and mild temperature. And then we took this to the hospital. We did a CT scan. And because it's not destructive, we could repeat it over time. And this gave us the kind of internal shape of the nest that these ants excavated in the soil column. And this is just a kind of simplified result, but you can see that the ants were able to adjust nest structure depending on the heat on the surface. So if you had mild temperature, they excavate a small nest, shallow nest, and these nests change little over time. So at the beginning, you have 200 workers. After 3 months, you have 600 workers on average, but the nest is just a little bit bigger, but not much bigger. If you have medium surface temperature or high surface temperature, within just 1 week, they excavate much deeper nest. That means that they do whatever they can to escape the heat on the surface. And as the colonies grow, the nests grow. And in medium treatment, they tend to grow in a kind of mid-depth, and at a very high temperature, they grow really at the bottom of the soil column. That means that the ants excavate deeper nests so they can rear their brood at the right temperature to produce workers of the correct size. That means that behaviors can allow to kind of mitigate a negative effect of global changes, in this case, temperature. But of course, this can have cost. If you have a colony with a few hundred workers, excavating a deeper nest is not really costly, so it's not a big problem. But if you are a queen starting a nest independently, solitarily, then there might be a much stronger effect. So yeah, I think this highlights that behavior is are very interesting because they allow for really rapid response, and therefore they are really of interest in climate changes. And the last example, it was again how ants answer to heat stress, in this case in foraging. And so we expose colonies to either acute stress or chronic stress. So it was a stress of 10 minutes, 1 hour, or continuous for 2 weeks. And the temperature was 25, 30, or up to 40 degrees. And we just monitored what happened under these circumstances. And so we looked at the latency before foraging, at the number of foraging trips, the survival of foragers, the survival of colonies. And to make it simple, basically, if stress is really short, then you need a very high stress to have an effect. If it's chronic stress, even not very stressful conditions like 35 degrees are starting to have an impact. And if it's very high, then it's basically often little. So of course, this is in the lab, so they can't really escape the heat. In the field, you might have behavioral flexibilities that may allow escaping the heat to some extent. For instance, you can have shifting the time of day when they forage. So if it's too warm during the day, they might start to forage more at dawn or at dusk or even during the night. So you might have some possibilities for behavior to help adjust. But then, of course, behavior on its own will not solve all the problems. Because if you start foraging at different times of the day, maybe what you are normally feeding on is not available here, or maybe you are not capable of functioning well during at night because you're kind of a daylight ant, or you will be exposed to other species that you're not supposed to interact with. So you might have plenty of cascading effect. So behavior is really useful to adjust to the global changes, but it's not a kind of silver bullet. It's not going to solve all the problems that the species are facing. But so to conclude very briefly, as it was said, environment is changing. It's happening now. Selective pressures are changing, and organisms are changing right now, including their behaviors. So we need to consider global changes in our study, even if it's not our main interest, because it's happening and we can't evade it. And we need to study behavior, because behavior is really one way for the organism to answer on a short term to climate change before evolution happens, maybe. And this is because behavior is very flexible. It allows very rapid response. But as I said, it's only a kind of it only allows responding to some pressure, but not everything. So I think this was very brief, but this is because I wanted more to discuss and present what I was doing.
Thanks, Thibaud. It was really interesting. Actually, like, there's someone who asked a question in the chat that somehow you reply. So it's La Marie Morales who say great workshop. Which species do you think could be the best indicator of behavioral changes driven by climate change? Or maybe it's not it's not just about the species, but also the study location. Somehow you kind of show that ants could be a very good indicator because they are very fast at modifying, like for instance, the nest due to temperature.
Yeah, but I think there are so many species. I mean, many species could be good indicators. I think it really depends on the kind of global change you are thinking of. But yeah, ants are quite well-suited species for some things. But
actually, it will bring me to another question that all of you can reply, because I guess when you are working on the field, for instance, or like with laboratory animal, it's always very hard to know whether like you are really observing a direct effect of climate change or maybe a sort of synergy with something else. Because I imagine, for instance, let's say pesticide will not have an effect on bees by a certain temperature, and now that the temperature increase, it starts to have an effect. So I was wondering if you, all of you guys in your own field, you already observed something that was okay before, and that start to have an effect on the model now that temperature have increased, for instance, or at least with the climate change.
well, not me. I did observe a bit like Erika that we had some unusual conditions in the field. Like already 10 years ago, we had some like the season of production of sexuals was not at the same time as it used to be. It probably was a two-week difference, and that was a big problem for us. But
yeah, Erika, you wanted to follow up on this, maybe?
Yeah, so for me, I think it's the extreme weather changes and that the usual patterns that we had in the savannah of like the wet summer, dry winter are not predictable at all, and also the fruiting of the trees that usually are once in the summertime can happen multiple times. Like things are like really, and some years will be totally too dry and other too wet, and like, yeah, I think those extremes are really for me quite puzzling and scary also of how it will carry on, and also just for safety reasons. So we often have to cross the river to go and find some groups of monkeys, and some of the rains are sometimes so intense that it can start to be flooding very quickly, where usually it will be only the next day after the rain that it will be hard to cross. But now sometimes people would go out in the morning, and then we have to call them back in to be sure that they can still cross back before without being washed out by the. So really concrete things, and also the amount of time people stay blocked. We have big 4x4 when we drive on the dirt road, but it gets so muddy and deep that at the start of the project we would never be stuck, and now it's so often that we need the help from others to get the car out of somewhere. And I think those things are just showing a bit the extreme. And if it's for us with all the comfort we have, like to understand the impact it has on natural a population, and especially for me, like long-lived animals who might be less flexible and rely more on things that they learn over a longer period, then will their will they survive? How much will they shift to different home range and stuff? It's I think also what we need to study now. How can they adapt? Where and we have started now 3 years ago in collaboration with my colleague Sophia Forst in Zurich, urban vervet project. So vervets are one of the rare primate species who adapt very well to rural and urban environments. And we collect this similar kind of data as I have the 15 years in the wild now from saying 3 years in this population living around humans. And it's really very interesting to see how they seem to adapt, and they are a lot fatter and they have more survival of their like the births are going better, but then the number of car accident is insane. We lose a lot of the little ones there, and also we find individuals that are quite young that are dying, and they have actually cancer and tumor that we never found in the wild ones. So now it's also, again, a total different environment, and there are so many different factors that can induce the stress, what they eat from the garbage of humans and stuff that can lead to this, that we want also to now disentangle a bit more.
Okay. Yeah, Thibaud.
Yeah, but it's true that now we have so many different factors which are changing at the same time that you might have interactions.
Yeah.
So as you said, you have for insect, you have pesticide, insecticide, and then you have this kind of only thing. And that means that if we want to be able to tackle them, maybe we will need to kind of change a bit the way we work and to work with more collaborators, because you don't have the capacity to treat all the factors by yourself.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think control a lot of things for species that we can have in captivity, like that we can really influence with one factor, because for us it's so messy, like there are so many things and it stays correlation and potentially it's this, that, and yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of to include in your line of research at the end, because like maybe you just started to try to understand a specific behavior, but then you have so many factors that came into that you just go in a new line of research somehow. It's actually a question that that I wanted to ask, is that like, do you see yourself at term maybe have to switch to really something focusing on climate change, because maybe like more and more you observe this and more you want to really ask this type of question and really focus on that?
Was it for me? I can
It
answer,
can
but I also
for, I
want to
mean,
let the other.
it can be for Thibaud or for you or for Gopal. Yeah, I mean, just like, yeah, if at some point, like, because you are observing the effect of this climate change, and so maybe at some point you're like, okay, maybe it's time for me to just start focusing only on this question. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I'm starting to be a bit more interested by climate change. Like we are starting a project on how it affects cognition in social insect in ants. But I guess it's only, I guess I'm more interested by the cognition. I think maybe global change is just one way to kind of enter a field of interest.
Yeah.
It's more like an opportunity. I don't know. It's kind of converging interest.
Yeah. So it's a bit what I was saying, that like at term maybe just interesting to include it in all your study somehow by just putting some of the data.
I think you have to, because as Gopal said, you can't consider your population is a kind of at the basal level anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe it's already changing, and therefore you have to consider what factors might be making it change.
Yeah. Erica, you wanted to reply to this? Oh.
Yeah, so one of my current grant is looking at this different stress and health food consumption across the wild vervets, the urban one, and in captivity, where we can control more. And this is, of course, linked to the fact that more and more vervets have no more wild environment, but are pushed towards human infrastructures. And then, of course, last year, when we started having so many deaths that was linked to something in the environment, then you're like, okay, we have to try to pinpoint what it is if we want the field site to carry on. So sometimes it's not because I decided consciously that I want to investigate more in this, and that it's this, or like if I don't focus on this now, potentially there will not be the other behavioral data I'm interested in, the cognition, the social learning that I love to do over the 15 years. But if I don't have the animals there anymore, then
so like
so I think it's just more an emergency, urgency thing that you're forced in. But I think it is really relevant, and we need to consider this and to see how and think together, and also think together on is it still in the current state of the planet, is it still ethical to have a field site that is like the down in the south? Or I think that there is a lot we need to think of how we were doing things up to now, and what should we still do or not.
Yeah, I think including, like you were telling earlier, the conference, that certainly we would have a way to travel less, do it in a new format in order to just like kind of impact less environment. So we have another question that I guess, Gopal, maybe you will be able to reply from Laure Cochard. So she's asking like, but I mean, maybe there is some effect of climate change that can be really less obvious, that maybe it will take years and years to start really seeing them. And she was wondering if there is any way to study this effect without waiting 10 years to see what happened. And she's talking about the effect in the wild, not in laboratory.
I see. That's a good question. I think I'm not quite remember any of those behaviors showing long-term effect. But then one fact of climate change, how climate change can transcend across species, is also based on, for example, their life history strategies, right? So ones, for example, that are much more live longer and reproduce slower are probably face much more challenges to start with, right? But then I could not think of anything that on top of my head, if there are any things that could actually take much longer to witness. But definitely any of those behaviors that I mentioned, have definitely have behavior is the first line of response. And obviously that have some costs associated with it, like what Thibaud mentioned. For example, once they start hiding in their environment, in their microhabitat, it's going to have some costs. For example, in foraging, that are obviously going to show up. But then I could not think of any actual example of things that could take much more longer time. But probably if others have any example, they could add up.
Okay, maybe Rika or Thibaud, you want to add something to this, or no? Okay. So I mean, time is flying because we are already arriving to the end of the workshop, and I would like to finish with more of a general question. I mean, we kind of went through it already, but if you had to really look really ahead in the future, like which aspect of the behavioral research you think will require the most significant adaptation in the next 20 years, let's say? Did you already think of this?
You mean which aspect of research? Sorry.
Yeah. Which aspect of research focusing on behavior will require the most significant adaptation in the next 20 years, based on what's happening in climate change?
So for sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
So for me, in the field of primatology, is the long-term field site. They are so valuable sites. We cannot move them. So like when we have 40 years of data on the chimp population, it's these ones that we know everything out of them. So whatever happens with climate change in those environments, we have to try to carry on. And I think like with what we have lived last year, it might be sometimes very unpleasant work, like when I was there and we had monkeys dying. And then the worst way was when I was just back in Switzerland, and I would wake up and I would have like 6-10 body of vervets and pictures to try to ID who it is. It's awful, but at the same time, like we have to understand who is dying and what is causing it and stuff. And I think that the long-term field site, I don't know how many will manage to carry on and for how long, and like how hard it will be also, depending how the environment change for researcher and the animals too. So
and out of curiosity, sorry, ethic wise, is it hard to make long-term study on vervet monkeys?
So ethic-wise, in South Africa, not at all. Vervets are considered pests. So we can do captures. We can do things that you cannot do on other primate population. People are still allowed to shoot them on private land. But then what is, of course, very hard to run a long-term, large-scale field site is funding, because people think, okay, you've studied them for 15 years, now you should stop. But now we finally have fitness data because the last female died last year that was adult when we started. So it takes time. It's not like with your ants, you can have all of this in one season, I guess, but we need to wait many years and to tackle really the interesting question. But now, of course, our fitness data are impacted also with climate change. So
I imagine that somehow also what you are saying here is that maybe if a funding scheme we are changing a bit, it will help going in the good direction regarding maybe studying climate change and behavior.
Yeah, I think then that's where I think the value of the long-term field site, where we can see we have a baseline before and see after on the same individuals how things change, and we can compare with the weather that year, the rain, the vegetation, the food, the population density, all this. I think this will be really valuable data. And if we start a new project somewhere and we don't know how it was before, with things changing now, I think we lose so much resolution. And so hopefully this is something that funders will understand, that is really very important to support.
Yeah, I imagine it also brings us to a lot of other debate about publication system and everything, because at the end, like for instance, I'm working on toxicology in zebrafish, and there are not so many people doing, for instance, multi-generational and transgenerational effect, because it takes so long. And so like you cannot really publish fast. So I guess that it also stopped quite a lot of people in doing this. But yeah. Thibaud, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think maybe in the coming years we're going to have to manage a much larger amount of data, because I think we're going to have plenty of data on tracking individuals, on genotyping individuals, on plenty of things. And I don't think everybody in the kind of animal behavior field is used to do this kind of big data set analysis. Well, I can do them, but I guess this is something I imagine is going to become increasingly important.
So like go towards more collaboration, what you were saying earlier, that maybe try to have more people knowing. Yeah, okay, yeah, I think it's a great idea. And Gopal, you have an idea?
Yeah, I have a couple of points. So I think one of the major aspect, at least what one can draw from behavior research, is that answering the thorny problem of which species are going to face extinction in the future, right? So far we have at the global distribution level, for example, we have been using correlative model, for example, like species distribution models, but then that has got a lot of underlying assumptions. But like exactly like what Erica has mentioned is that we need on-ground data of how tracking species population on how basically animal is responding, right? Because the mechanism by which species are locally going extinct, it's quite varied and it's quite unique to many different species, right? For example, species in the Arctic might face entirely different challenges of how they cope with climate and how exactly they sort of face their declines in their habitat when compared to species, for example, living in much more warmer parts of the world, right? So that sort of nuanced information of how species are responding is way more important in understanding or predicting future impacts, right? That has got, of course, important implications, because that plays a huge role in how we're going to conserve these species at the end of the day. And of course, as I mentioned, these behavioral examples, especially, for example, like what Erica has shown today, that exactly at what temperature do we see such shifts in behavior are very quite critical to model those species. Basically, we can use that information to build up those models from ground up to have a global analysis, for example, global overview to predict what's going to happen to the species in the future. So that aspect maybe is quite important that you can draw from behavior research, for instance.
Thanks a lot, Gopal. Yeah. So like we are running out of time. Thibaud, Erica, Gopal, thanks again for having participated to this discussion. I hope that you enjoyed as much as I did.
Well, thanks a lot for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks.